And hello there. Nice to see you all. I hope you're all doing good today. I and my colleagues are going to hopefully give you some basics for about space that will help you as you're thinking about and designing uh, designing war games for space in the future. To start off this panel, I'm going to do some discussions about outer space treaties and a little bit of international history related to space. And so I think everybody here is pretty good at understanding that space race, space competition first really started out during the Cold War. Big players were the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States and the Soviet Union had much of the first. And what's interesting is during the Cold War, the issues of prestige and practicality related to the development of space capabilities led different states to see those capabilities differently. And so, what you see with the Soviet Union is um, more focus on how to use those space capabilities for military, for national defense. And for the United States, you see a division between military uses of space, but also the civilian scientific uses of space. And so, what you see is during the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union are doing their space competition, you see these different trends of how to use space emerging and kind of driving the different ways that policy and international treaties begin to develop. And so, one of the interesting things is that during the Cold War, because of many of the first occurred were done by the Soviet Union, that the United States, up until the 1969 landing on the moon, the Soviet Union was seen as being in the lead. And yet, what's interesting is that if you look at that from a policy perspective, is that those first allowed different international norms to be established. So the ideas of overflight, the ideas of you know, astronauts being returned safely to their home nation. Those norms began being established because of these firsts that occurred. And so from these firsts, we see that in 1967, we see the emergence, the creation of the Outer Space Treaty and the United Nations. And as of my last check, there are 108 nations that have signed on to the UN Treaty of Outer Space. And when you're thinking about war games and you're thinking about things that should and should not be done in relation to space activities, looking at the space treaty and the articles and how things are considered permitted and not permitted is a good way to understand what kind of actions um, can occur in these games, but also what kind of reactions you can provide for those actors, the players that are engaged in those war games. And so when you're looking at the Outer Space Treaty and the UN Council on Peaceful Uses of Space, hope I got that right, has not only the list of the UN Outer Space Treaty, but also every treaty as well as General Assembly um, agreements that have occurred in relation to space. And so using those as kind of a stepping stone for when you're doing those space games is a way to kind of think about how can you see different actors responding to different events, whether they've signed the space treaty or not, but also how they would use the treaty, or in other words, or also try to be smart and game the treaty to do certain actions. And so what I mean is the idea that in the outer space treaty, looking at the articles and you're talking about what you can and cannot do, the idea that military installations are not allowed on celestial bodies. That's like the moon, asteroids, and other planets. It's not necessarily the actual void of space. And so when you're thinking about different actions and different installations, whether it's military, scientific, commercial, those different capabilities, those different ways things are identified and what is and is not allowed are different ways to think about what kind of scenarios you might want to put into those war games. Brent, Dr. Ziarnick, Dr. Smith, you want to pop in with anything that relates as I'm going? Feel free to. Don't let me sit here by myself. And so when you're thinking about the space treaty, in particular, going through and looking at those articles, so like when you're thinking about trying to find the article real quick. So like Article 2, provides that nations cannot claim celestial bodies as national territory. You cannot claim sovereignty on celestial bodies. So on the moon, you cannot claim parts of the moon as being part of your nation. So the United States lands on the moon, and yet it cannot claim that landing spot for the United States. And if you think about what Neil Armstrong says when he takes foot on the moon, he says, for all mankind. He doesn't say for the United States specifically. And so when you're thinking about what these different articles mean, whether it's nations cannot claim territory on space, but what about objects that they put on those different celestial bodies? Those still do belong to either the nation or whoever put it up there. And so there are different interesting ways that things can be done in space on celestial bodies, so like the moon, asteroids, and other planets, compared to things that can and cannot be done in the void of space, for specifically. So like the idea that in space itself, you cannot put nuclear weapons, you cannot put weapons of mass destruction in orbit in space. But that doesn't mean you can't put like rockets in space. It doesn't mean you can't put nuclear engined satellites in space, and what you do with them once they get up there. So there are these interesting and in some ways kind of imaginative actions that can be done in space, if you're willing to, when you're thinking about how to do a war game and how you would see different actors participating in those war games. And then another thought too is when we think of space actors, don't just think about the countries that have launch capabilities. Think of all the nations that have some type of space capability out there, whether they can actually launch it up there or they have to go to somebody else, to another state to do it, or a commercial entity to do it. Being able to having something in space is a better way to think of a space actor than being able to launch something into space. And I say that because when you're thinking about space and you're thinking about space actors, when you're thinking about, and I'll get back to that question in a second, when you're thinking about how those actors will use those capabilities. Yeah, Brent, go ahead. I'll come back to it.
No, it's interesting about the Outer Space Treaty, and this isn't part of my presentation necessarily, but the Outer Space Treaty is fraught with a lot of misunderstandings, and it has been since the very beginning, because most people say that, well, space is for peaceful purposes. That is in the treaty, but what does peaceful purposes mean? And then there is a restriction on no weapons of mass destruction to be stationed in space. Like if you remember that old movie Space Cowboys a while back, there was an old defunct Russian satellite that had, a dozen nuclear tipped missiles or something like that. That is straight up illegal. But most people assume that, well, there's no, it's illegal to have weapons in space, which is not true under the Outer Space Treaty. But then you've got what everyone thinks the Outer Space Treaty says and what it actually says. So when you're dealing with a political issue like a legal treaty, it's most of the time going to go with whoever, what the majority thinks the treaty says, not necessarily what it does say. And there's a lot of people that dislike the Outer Space Treaty because of it. So sorry, just wanted to jump in on that a little bit there.
No, and that's a good point, because when you're thinking about the Outer Space Treaty, in particular those peaceful purposes and those state actors, how those states interpret what is peaceful has a good bearing on what they do and don't do in space. Dr. Brent, Dr. Smith, you got something?
Yeah, I sure do. First of all, the opinion that I express is mine and mine alone, and not that of the U.S. government or of Air University. And that's probably true of my peers as well. Uh, the Outer Space Treaty is not worth the paper that it's printed on. It's a worthless document that you can violate at will across the board. The Russians are moving chemical weapons into Ukraine now. They've threatened nuclear weapons use. Come on. We're going to have to wake up to the fact that behavior in space will not be better than behavior on Earth, and behavior on Earth is pretty abysmal. We have to be prepared for every contingency. And, just like the Chinese who have seized the South China Sea by inventing islands that they themselves have constructed, we also see that behavior with them in Antarctica, where they're going around with the same type of rovers that they're operating on the backside of the moon. And in Antarctica, they're planting little tiny flags with little names and numbers on them so that they can claim exclusionary zones, not ownership of the property, but scientific safety exclusionary zones, so that they and only they can have access to that area. We anticipate that they are doing that on the backside of the moon as well, and that they will do that type of behavior wherever they go. Um, when I say the outer space tree is not worth the paper it's printed on, the general thought is that that is a representation of the American and Western way of the world. That's a Western norm, which the Russians and the Chinese are pretty much committed to throwing out the window to replace with what they would prefer to be their norms. My opinion only.
And so when you're thinking about the Outer Space Treaty, this is one of the things to keep in mind. It's like it has things that are written, but again, how the actors respond and do or do not abide by those treaties and find ways to skirt what is written in the laws, those matter. And the other thing is that anytime a country can join, but can also leave the Outer Space Treaty. You're not permanently connected to this treaty if you so decide. And so when you're thinking about the Outer Space Treaty and the articles, but also the treaty on astronauts, the treaty on the moon and other celestial bodies, look at them, read them to kind of see how the international treaties, also state laws related to space, are set up, and how your state or that space actor would respond to those different treaty norms. And then the other thing is to also think about the idea that when when many of these treaties were originally created, we did not have the commercial space entities that we have today, and that in itself creates a whole nother wrinkle into how these laws are interpreted. Granted, the Outer Space Treaty says that states, including non-state entities, including which would include commercial uh, actors in those countries, are under the umbrella of the state. The state is responsible for all of them. But again, how those different states see those laws, how they interpret those treaties and amendments, those will, as you're doing those war games, they will matter and affect how different scenarios might turn out. What was that question that popped up? Hmm. Actually, I'm not entirely sure that there's any how that one would be interpreted, because I don't think once you dig it out, it's yours. It's a resource. Brent, Coyote.
Um, this is definitely open to interpretation, but there's a lot of interpretation going on right now, or at least attempts to uh, come to international agreement on the meaning of the Outer Space Treaty. So, according to the Space Commercialization Act of 2015, or there's a Space Act in 2015. I cannot remember what it's called exactly, but it sort of established in U.S. law what's considered a space resource and what U.S. companies can do with it. You cannot have, according to that law that was passed by Congress, signed by President Obama at the time, you cannot take sovereignty over an area. But if you extract a resource and then process it somehow, that becomes your property. So the idea would be that under U.S. law, if you were able to develop a, turn the lunar regolith or something like that into a brick, and then build, take that material and then build something out of it, and then, launch it into space or something like that, that would indeed be your property, and you would not have, claim sovereignty over whatever celestial body you got the resource from. So, of course, that is open to interpretation, which is why the U.S., the lobbyists for space people tried to get that law passed to begin with, because other people in the community might say, hey, anytime you take something from a celestial body and then try to sell it, you can't, because you don't own it. You don't have rights over it. And that's why there's still a lot of debate, and we pay a lot of, I'm not sure if we pay them very well, but there's a lot of space lawyers out there arguing about this stuff all the time. So great question. Not a really great answer. So sorry about that.
If I could chime in on that, one of the things I'm concerned about is the incongruity between the Outer Space Treaty and its implications and the Declaration of Human Rights and the millennial objectives that are laid out by the United Nations. The United Nations establishes the fact that individuals have the right to private property ownership and the right to profit from the fruit of their labor. Why is it when I go above the Van Karman line at 100 kilometers that suddenly there's no national appropriation and therefore no one to award a deed, and therefore I can't own private property even though I'm a human? And why is it the way the Outer Space Treaty is written that it's for the benefit of all humankind, and somehow I'm supposed to cut a check to 7.5 billion people for the profit I generate on orbit? These are ambiguities that need to be clarified. Now, we have a very active commercial sector that is very able to settle these types of things, and they have enough money to hire enough lawyers to do that. Something that's problematic for us is we have the arms control community inside our State Department trying to establish the rules of the road, the codes of conduct, the customary law, and eventually the formal international space law that will be developed. I'm not entirely sure that that's the community that I want doing that, because allowing nothing is at least safe in the arms control perspective.
But allowing nothing creates other restrictions and hindrances. And as we're seeing, space is no longer just peaceful and scientific, it's also commercial. And so that's an interesting question about the national jurisdictions in into space. Space itself, there are no national jurisdictions in space. It's not like airspace where you have like you have here on Earth. Up in space, there are no national jurisdictions. You don't have, last I looked, if I'm wrong, please correct me. You don't have claim over the outer space over the physical land on Earth.
That's right. And I'd actually like to raise an interesting point here. One of our compatriots, Dr. Everett Carl Dolman, or as we refer to him, Dr. Evil, he raises a very good point. In the International Telecommunications Union has the responsibility for managing those orbital slots up there at the geostationary belt, in addition to allowing the use of certain elements of the electromagnetic spectrum for command and control of satellites. He points out that becomes a property right. If you have actually been assigned a piece of astro real estate, if you will, at the geostationary belt, and you are allowed to negotiate and trade at a valued price for the use of that orbital slot, well, you've got a complaint if somebody violates that. That gives you tort, gives you a claim in a court of law. Dolman asks the question, why does not an international body such as the ITU, maybe not the ITU itself, zone out the moon and allow the use of lunar resources by that same type of management? I'm trying to cut to the question that was asked just a little bit earlier about national appropriation and the use of orbital slots as an analogy for how lunar, Martian, and maybe other resources could actually be validated. Take a look at the tremendous value of the asteroid belt. NASA's latest estimate is in a post-transactional world where the economy doesn't collapse because you flood the market. All those rare minerals and resources up there are valued at over $17 quintillion. Well, just imagine if you divided by the number of planets on this Earth a segment of that asteroid belt. That is one suggested way of managing that. It's not the U.S. federal government, and I'm just expressing my opinions.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking, I'm not entirely sure how likely I mean, there's always a possibility, but it's more along the lines of how likely is it that the treaties will be updated or we'll get new treaties. We're often getting like the Artemis Accord, but again, it's not a treaty per se. It's more of a gentleman's agreement among different countries. And so whether we get new treaties, whether they're multinational or bilateral, will depend on the state actors themselves. I don't know, or the other different types of space actors that are out there, because, you know, there are also commercial people out there too. So I'm not sure what the new treaties and laws are going to look like, but there's always something that's out there. And with that, I'm done with law. So Coyote or Brent, whoever wants to take over next.
Several years ago, I spent a great deal of time at UN Geneva while I was doing my Ph.D. work. And the gross dissatisfaction with the Outer Space Treaty and the lack of a proper body of international space law is something that really echoes amongst the entire cadre of people at UN Geneva, especially those that are in the Conference on Disarmament and the Prevention of Arms Race and Outer Space subcommittees. What I find fascinating to all of this is none of them want to open up the Outer Space Treaty because they believe that it would end in a never-ending battle between the United States, Russia, China, and what we would refer to as the traditional BRIC states that became such a factor in the formulation of the original space treaty. They don't think a resolution can be met. They think that the definition, the redefining of all the terms would just create a long period of unregulation or deregulation or unregulatability of space as a result of that. Sometimes I struggle with simple words. I'm sorry. And so with that, I just like to close out that thought and hand it over to Brent for his next topic.
Well, thanks. I've got a couple of slides that I'm going to try my best at sharing, but you know, I have to just by way of introduction, I used to be a fairly decent wargamer back when I was a kid, in that I played a lot of Supremacy, if any of you remember that game. But you know, now I'm more of a collector of games in that I have no time. But I collect a lot of them, and now my wife wants me to throw them all, you know, a lot of them away, or at least out, because I'm moving soon. But I want to talk a little bit about my experience about gaming, space wargaming, especially with commercial games, essentially as we've done here, or especially as we've done here in Air Command and Staff College's various iterations of space activity. So, you know, we're just going to get head right on in. So just some thoughts that I'd like to, you know, get to say, and then you can start asking questions. I can't see anyone right now afterwards, so maybe I'll take questions after I'm done, you know, opining. But just some things that I want to say about space wargaming as I see it. You can basically split, in my opinion, the space games that are out there right now between tactical space and strategic space games. In high school, I thought I was going to join the Navy rather than the Air Force, so I still tend to think in Navy terms. So if you wanted to think about a tactical Navy game, think about Harpoon, maybe, where you've got ship to ship. You're very interested in specific technologies. And you're trying to maneuver, you know, a discrete vehicle, or at the most a little bit of a, you know, some sort of squadron or fleet. And then strategic space, which is a much more broad game where you're not so much interested in, you know, standard, you know, single ship movements, but, you know, covering a large swath of national strategic stuff. And if you apply that to space, tactical space games, especially with technology that we have now, like satellites in orbit and stuff like that, are very, very difficult to do right. I don't know of anyone that's actually done them all that well. There are a couple of sort of tactical level satellite games that various agencies have done for the United States government. They succeed a little bit, but really, I don't think they're all that valuable. I have not found them very valuable because they're reliant on technology. Right now, the technology that we have today, and quite honestly, the technology we have today is sort of boring from a game perspective because there's not a whole lot of activity in orbit that can be done by individual satellites or individual systems or anything like that. But I would say that a tectonic shift in technology parameters may well indicate that our current understanding of space right now is completely tactically obsolete. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But strategic space games I found are much more valuable. And why is that? Because they can deal with, technology broadly defined, and incorporate a lot of different technologies that maybe we can anticipate, that we understand on a scientific level, but we just haven't engineered yet. But really a strategic game like a political military game, is much more interested in human nature, politics, economics, that kind of stuff. And as a guy that played Supremacy a lot with his friends and, the board game, and then played Master of Orion on the computer when I wasn't playing Civilization, the strategic game just seems to speak a lot more because you can base it on real things, Thucydides. Politics is pretty much the same in 2000 BC and 100 AD and 1555 and probably 2355. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But especially when you get into strategic gaming, space wargaming to me is uniquely suited to develop space legs, to get an understanding of the broader understanding of space for people that might not have it, and is good at strategic analysis of the space domain, really, especially with technology, and I'll get into it a little bit. But in order to do that, you have to have a game that might be extremely speculative, but it has to have a very firm foundation with physical accuracy. It has to model the physics of the space environment correctly. Even if it's a really simple, example of that, even if you simplify complex things in the game mechanics, as long as your base level understanding of your game, its foundation is based on physical accuracy, you can start to think that maybe your games might have some learning and some analysis value. Because really my aim for when I try to do games with students here is not just teaching them about space stuff, which it can do, but also for identifying emergent behavior in the space domain using, single players as agents. Because I have found out that even technical experts that are great at propulsion engineering, let's say, are usually relying on opinion when they think, hey, we should go one way versus another way, rather than actual analysis, which certain, games might be able to do. So, but why is it that tactical games might not be of a great deal of use? Well, because of the cost of space flight. And you can take a look at this. It's a cool little visual graphic from Visual Capitalist. They're great people. But you can't see much from this. But let's add a little bit of thought to it, or a little bit more definition. I would argue that the space systems we have now flying today operate under an old paradigm that is just about ready to break. And that is space being extremely expensive. On the order of 50,000 to, it says here $1,600 a kilogram to orbit. Space is incredibly expensive to get to. All of our satellites, all of our space shuttles, everything we've done up until this point, with a possible exception of the Starlink spacecraft, have been under the paradigm that it's extremely expensive to get up there. And there, therefore it's very, normally very big, not very maneuverable, and specifically engineered to do one thing well and cost effectively. But what's going to happen? Emerging space systems, especially exemplified by the SpaceX Starship, may well get the launch to orbit down to less than $300 a kilogram to orbit, an order of magnitude or more. That is why I think you're going to see a lot of different spacecraft emerging in the next 5, 10, 15 years that will totally change the mechanics of the paradigm. Different spacecraft doing different things under different operational profiles, which is why, to me, a current paradigm tactical game might not be very relevant for for essentially anything. But if, in case this one didn't get you to see how different life will be as far as the economics of space flight under the Starship, here's another view of it. Most everything, launch vehicles, including the Delta Heavy, the Falcon 1, the Falcon 9, the Angara, all that kind of stuff is still relatively high. And Starship is in the corner there at almost, well, here on the map, it says almost zero. The cost of space flight is going to go down by at least an order of magnitude if Starship works. If that happens, there's going to be a huge difference in the space domain as we go. So you're dealing with tactical games. I will say that I tried to use a spacecraft game called Attack Vector Tactical early on because it has a very good physically accurate model of the space environment. The AVID thing, which is on the middle of the screen, actually incorporates a lot of weird stuff about orbital attitude control, pitch, roll, yaw, heat management, energy management, all this kind of stuff. Can you get a good firing position and all that kind of stuff? Really interesting. It's extremely useful to get a feel for how weird space is when you're operating equipment there. But what's the problem? Well, it models spaceship combat, not satellite combat. And it's science fiction. It might be well-developed, physically accurate science fiction, but it's still that. So it's not particularly useful if we're going to use something on, say, for Space Force Guardian education or something like that. Attack Vector does not really model how space is right now, although it may model it pretty well for even in the midterm to reasonably near-term or reasonably long-term future that we might end up seeing. But it's an honorable mention at best. Strategic space games, I think, are the way to go if you're going to use commercial games for trying to develop a space sense. Because I think they are good at strategic analysis of the space domain because it incorporates human nature, economics, politics, all the stuff that we are pretty sure is going to work in space as well as it works on the ground, which might be not a whole lot. But you can still rely maybe a little bit on its lessons as maybe the way things would really go. But only if you have a physically accurate model. You have to be able to model real technology that people have developed papers for, have thought about, have tried to design, in order for it to be somewhat realistic. Because even though we don't know what technology is going to be in 2050 and 2060, we're pretty sure the basic understandings of what a fusion rocket could and could not do, right? Most space stuff right now is not a science problem as much as it is an engineering problem. But if you have good physically accurate games that are dealing with strategic decisions, you might be able to find emergent behavior in the space domain under this new paradigm. And again, I'm going to say that a lot of experts, myself included, have a lot of guesses, maybe even educated opinions that might collapse under real analysis. And I want to just talk a little bit about two games in particular. One is called High Frontier. And if you take a look at this map here, you'll see it's very complex and it doesn't limit itself to near Earth space. It incorporates the entire solar system. But this game in particular is designed by a guy named Phil Eklund, who, called himself a recovering aerospace engineer. So you know that it's, at least you hope, that it's physically accurate. And it is for the most part. It models pretty much every near to midterm future technology that we've ever thought about in space, short of warp drive and stuff like that. But it's very, very technically detailed. And I think it's pretty good at propulsion technology strategy assessment. And why do I think that? Because I've got a little bit of a personal anecdote. I was going to I was at a conference, the Tennessee Valley Interstellar Workshop, where a lot of people get together to talk about interstellar spacecraft, which you can do to a certain level. But I ran into a guy that became a pretty good friend of mine at Marshall Space Flight Center that knew an awful lot about solar sail technology. And I always dismissed solar sails as being sort of boring, and I focused on sort of heavy nuclear stuff, nuclear thermal rockets, fusion rockets, and nuclear pulse propulsion, which I ended up doing some historical work on and stuff like that. I thought the future was in heavy nuclear spacecraft engine technology, and but my friend gave me this book that he wrote, like, hey, you really should look at solar sails because you can do a lot with it. Well, hey, great. I took it, I looked through it a little bit, and then had to move on with other things. But about a year later, I was playing High Frontier, and I decided that I was going to devote my entire game to develop heavy nuclear propulsion technology that could get us out to Jupiter, Saturn, you name it. I was going to own the solar system. And it took forever. But the person I was playing against built very small, very cheap solar sail technology so well that he pretty much was all over, owned the entire inner solar system with this basic solar sail technology. When I was still trying to figure out how to build a heavy spacecraft on Earth, he won. And I was totally, caught off guard by it. Is that a gameism? Or is that real emergent behavior that you can do a lot of really neat things with a lot cheaper technology? Well, there was a lot of growth for me because I ended up reading the solar sail book, and now I'm a lot happier with solar sails than I used to be. And that was because of a game, the strategic game. Is it still gameism? I don't know. I still like nuclear stuff, but that's the kind of growth that you can have, even for a person that might have, spent a couple of years learning astronautical engineering. But just to move on, because I know I'm dominating the conversation, and I'm sorry about that. But the last game that I've got is the one that I use the most at in my elective at ACSC now, my space elective. That's called Stellar Horizons. That was designed by a guy that got his Ph.D. from MIT named Andrew Rader, Canadian, very nice, stuff like that. But he was developed this game, and then shortly after the game was just about ready to be published, he got a job at SpaceX as a mission manager for the Falcon Heavy. So he knows what he's doing, and this is also a near to midterm future game with real technologies, but this is more of a strategic, almost grand strategic level Paul Mill econ game in ways that might be a little bit broader than High Frontier. He deals with classes of technology, technology trees and other things, as opposed to specific technologies that High Frontier does. But what I have found is that taking people, and my students are oddly enough mostly air crew, because space people don't take my space wargaming elective for some reason. I found that it's really good at modeling great power competition in space. Because people can be China or the United States or Russia or European Union and other, quasi-fictional sort of states. But, you can model a lot of good activity. And, if you had this type of technology, which is doable if we ever decided to field it, how would states react if people are trying to go to the moon, if people are trying to go to Mars? And it's really good because it's got a good physics-based model. And I can find very little wrong with it. I mean, there is a little bit of gameism about technology development can only be done every 10 years, and that changes the game a little bit. It's really good at, if you come up with a scenario, you can run that scenario with the more or less open sandbox of the entire solar system board to really find emergent behavior. And now that I've gone through only a handful of classes with this, probably not enough to say that there's emergent behavior that we're seeing that might be translatable to real life. Nonetheless, there are some really interesting things that happen that aren't expected, that seem to be fairly common among players, even with not a whole lot of space experience. So I can't get into the conclusions really, because I don't just, my sample size is just not enough. But it does lead me to believe that strategic space gaming, as long as it has a decent physics-based model, can be used to teach a lot of interesting things and learn things yourself or myself. So just to reiterate, I like strategic space gaming, and I think it's much more valuable um, than maybe games that the Space Force would be interested in now, because space operations just aren't to that level where you can have a very good, robust tactical game that would teach you anything. Strategic space games, much more valuable, I think, because you can model things that most people don't think about, like the Artemis Accords, which is, a NASA/State Department bilateral treaty system to try to uh, essentially steal the narrative on what the Outer Space Treaty actually means. And is it to the good? I believe it is, but it's still a political, maneuver. And for other people that might not understand space at all to develop their space legs, my current class that is going through this game right now are all air crew. They didn't know anything about space, and now just after a few weeks of playing this game, they can have a much more broad and understanding discussion of even current space news than they used to in the past. And even though you have to take that learning with a grain of salt, if it's physically accurate, if the game system is physically accurate, it can give, in my opinion, some good thoughts for how the emergent behavior of the space domain may work even in the near-term future. But to that level, I think I've spent way too much time, but that's all I've got. So I'm perfectly willing to stop sharing. And I appreciate your time. If you don't mind me saying, how can naval and air warfare paradigms be applied to space warfare? Or how is it a new ball game? I do not believe it is a brand new ball game. I used to think that Navy stuff was way better tactical and strategic. I no longer believe that. If you want to do space strategy, if you want some historical analysis, you have to go to Navy theory entirely. The air guys lost the ball with regard to whole of government, whole of economic kind of stuff in air power in like the 20s with General Mitchell. That being said, I'm a huge Navy guy, but I will tell you that, I'm a reserve officer and have dealt with, sort of operational space control stuff. And I can't get too into it, but tactically at the satellite level, it does seem to me that air tactics have marginally more utility to open the aperture of what might be able to be done in space. So from a tactical perspective, air might be a little bit better, but from a strategic perspective, it's Navy thinking is way better than anything the air guys have ever done. Countries is a little bit difficult. It's fun that as much as we think that the U.S. is sort of falling behind, everyone is still following pretty much exactly what we do. Most of the Chinese space program is just operationalizing things that NASA came up with like 15, 20 years ago, or doing things that the U.S. has done. So from a state perspective, the U.S. is still pretty much doing the United Launch Alliance stuff. SpaceX is really dragging people into the future. So the most incredible things that are happening in SpaceX, I personally believe that Starship needs to work to get that kilogram to orbit down to the hundreds in order for anything new to happen in space. I wish them luck. I do not see anyone else doing even remotely that. From a state perspective, be it Russia or China or the United States, they're all from a state level playing the same game that has been going on for about 20 years. And I don't see a whole lot of change. So, Blue Origin might be having a few space things. There's some minor experiments that are going on with radically new designs. and oh my goodness gracious, sorry about that. They're claiming that my computer is going to restart, and I'm going to stop that. There are some interesting things like spin launch that's going on in New Mexico right now, which is really exciting. But from a state perspective, I think the states are going to get dragged into the future with launch, because especially with those future, the cost of space slides, all of that ruthless decrease to almost zero launch costs, not state related. That is entirely SpaceX. Maybe using a couple of U.S. government dollars, but it's definitely not the government doing it. I hope that helps.
So if I could pop in too on that last question, I think in some ways the interesting thing about the states versus the commercial entities is the different drivers for why they're trying to get into space. And so when you're thinking about SpaceX trying to get into space, they're a commercial entity. Their desire is to make money, but also to find things that they can sell. And so for them, getting that dollar per kilogram down is a driving factor for them to invest in finding better technology to get things up into space. And so I think in some ways that drive is going to lead commercial entities to be more innovative for space. That will then end up, like Brent was saying, dragging the states with them. But I think that in some ways the states are kind of, because of they are states, they're kind of stuck being kind of slow and expensive, kind of like what Brent was saying with his desire for the nuclear heavy lift satellites versus the solar sails. There's kind of that difficulty pulling away from the traditions and the ways things have been done versus being willing to seek out and find new ways to do something better, also possibly faster. And so I think that states are probably going to get, like Brent was saying, get dragged along to improving their space technology for whether it's national security, civil purposes, whatever. They'll probably get dragged along the innovative force by commercial entities.
Well, that's a great question about the drone and robot based warfare. I don't know. What's more important is I don't think anyone else will know either. So that's what gaming has to do is if we can make a good accurate model and then just start playing things out, we can eliminate a lot of bad opinions and try to figure out what might happen. I think there's a great human future in space, but from a weapon like star or space fighter perspective, yeah, I think it's going to be drones are going to be what's happening or what goes on. I think that's how air power is going, quite honestly. So will it change Space Command? Or U.S. Space Command? I don't know, but I think it's going to be a whole heck of a lot of trial and error. And the more we can use gaming to do that trial and error, at least in broad stroke, we can inform real world programs a lot better.
And then if I can pop into that as well, and that last one is also, we talk about space being congested and contested. And if you're thinking about congested space, we're not just talking about satellites, we're talking about all that orbital debris. And so if you're going to be discussing what the drones and the robots in space are doing, also making sure that you include that debris aspect as well. If I remember, there was a lot of cry out with the China ASAT in 2007 and the Russian one in 2021, and what that debris does, because unlike air and the sea, space doesn't have a built-in cleaning process. Once it's up there, it's kind of stuck up there. So I think if you're going to include that, you're going to want to also include those issues, which is why what Brent was saying about it being having to be, have the science right. You're going to want to incorporate what that debris is also going to be doing when you're doing those type of games as well.
Sven Stoop, you ask an interesting question. Is wargaming used outside of our classes to explore the near future of space in support of the debate? No, it's not. And it's too bad because we would have a much more informed set of questions asked by people if they had some visualizations of what's going to happen. Uh, I might as well start in on my part. I'm the old codger in this group. My job is to provide humorous commentary, which are my own and not that of the government, and to ensure that some other things are just kind of cleaned up as we think about wargaming. I came out of the space control community. Spent 30 years in the Air Force, most of it in the space control community. I'm a space weapons officer. Why do you think they call us space weapons officers? Well, I can't tell you why they call us space weapons officers. Well, let me just give you a couple of stories to set things in mind. Space has a tremendous vantage point and view of the Earth. But you know what? Earth has a tremendous vantage point and view of space. Nobody ever attacks a satellite from their own country. You go to somebody else's country and attack from there. That allows you to false flag things, make it much more ambiguous. Most space warfare starts with, as the Russians did with this latest engagement in Ukraine, with cyber attacks against ground stations, etc. And the Russians have proved very effective. Eutelsat Corporation is just limping along now, trying to recover or replace their ground stations that were lost to Russian attacks. Well, back around 2005, there was an incident that took place where the United States was losing an awful lot of its remotely piloted vehicle reconnaissance time over the Middle East. We were in places such as Afghanistan and Iraq. There was a particular satellite that for some reason was losing the signals that it was carrying overseas from Beale Air Force Base or from Creech Air Force Base just north of Las Vegas, where our remotely piloted vehicles are commanded from. Well, we did some looking and we realized that that satellite was being jammed off the air on those particular frequencies carrying our remotely piloted vehicle signals. So we did some more looking and we realized that the origin of the jamming signal was coming out of Cuba. So we demarched Cuba, and Cuba responded back to us almost immediately and they go, "We're not jamming anything and we don't want any problems. And what can we do to help you figure this out?" And so we sent a spectrum analysis team down to Cuba, and they discovered in a Cuban hotel room on one of the higher floors, shooting out the window with a southern exposure out to the geostationary belt, was a team of Iranians who were jamming American signals over the continental United States that was preventing those satellites from carrying those signals to and from the Middle East, or Southeast Asia, I should say. That just gives you an idea of the degree of false flagging that goes on routinely every day regarding the negation attempts that are made on satellites. Space was never a sanctuary. It has always been an electromagnetic shooting gallery up there. The best weapon to use against a communications satellite is another communications satellite, because you can so easily match your frequencies to that other satellite's frequencies, not just for uplink, but also for downlink jamming to the receiver sets of customers down below. You can emulate signals, you can mock signals, you can spoof signals. It's an old game. And it's one of those games that that no one is really very good at. Something that's problematic for us, and the reason why this doesn't come to the public's attention is because space is out of sight and out of mind. And if the federal government were to admit that it has no plan on how to deal with these counter space activities, it could probably damage the commercial space industry. And it could probably also damage that administration's reputation amongst the public. And I'm talking about both political parties here. I'm being a fair and balanced despiser of all politics in every direction. And by the way, my comments are my own and not those of the federal government. Um, Space warfare, as I say, is an old damn game. And you don't need to have a high powered laser to create a high powered laser effect on a satellite. Just a few low or fewer medium power lasers are all that it takes, because laser light is additive on the surface you shine it on. And so you get a let's two medium power lasers, one pulsing at one frequency rate and another one pulsing at a different frequency rate. And the fact that they're pulsing means that their amplitudes are going to line up in short order and create a magnificent, super high powered event on the satellite that you're targeting. These are just tricks that we learn left and right the hard way. There are four communities that persist in telling the narrative that space is a sanctuary, even though those that tell the story that space is a sanctuary know that it isn't. It's a bunch of wishful thinking at this point. There are people that are realists, hardcore realists. They tend to be conservative, and in America, they tend to be Republican. And they don't want to admit that space was not a sanctuary or is not a sanctuary, because they don't want to be giving free battle damage estimates to an adversary in the belief that confirming that they're having an effect will entice them to create more more satellite jamming effects. The other community tend to be very dreamy idealists. They tend to be liberals, and in the United States, they tend to be Democrats. And they persist in the narrative that space is a sanctuary because, well, it ought to be, and maybe we can figure out a way to make it so. That kind of feeds into the next community, which is an international community, oftentimes imbued by environmental causes such as climate change and space debris on orbit. They persist that space is a sanctuary, or it ought to be, um, based on the idea that they believe they can create international norms and regulations and put the genie back in the bottle. Hasn't worked very well with the nuclear equation, and we're not entirely sure it's going to work very well with this counter space realm as well, or either. The last one is the commercial space sector, where if the commercial space sector told their customers that they are unable to secure their satellites should there be hostile jamming, and that a lot of their customers are governments who may get into wars with each other, and that there's no assurance that those signals would not be jammed, that would be bad for business. Um, and so they persist in the narrative that space is a sanctuary, but it is not, and it has not been. Now, to date, nations have been incredibly responsible. The number of kinetic ASAT events is tiny. That's good news because we don't want space debris. Space professionals know that they don't want to create space debris for the same reason that sailors don't mine their own harbors and soldiers don't put minefields in their own camps. Space debris is bad. The good news and the bad news is that while space debris is bad, there is nobody really making a massive concerted effort to build kinetic destruction ASATs. There sure is a ton of action trying to build electromagnetic jammers, both brute force and smart jamming. Brute force just being overpowering a signal, smart jamming being getting into the internals of a satellite and damaging it on the interior. There's cyber attacks against satellites that are continuing every day. Not only the satellites themselves, but largely those ground stations. And you know, one to some degree, one of the methods of attacking space systems has been to attack the actual people, their bank accounts, their personal cybersecurity, who work inside the space industry, keeping them distracted with their own personal problems in the cyber realm, while other techniques are taken advantage of on orbit because of the window of time that they create for themselves. Um, Microwave type of attacks on orbit, signal matching takes place to cause satellites to come down. We're looking for these satellites that do rendezvous, refueling, and maintenance. Yeah, they do that during peacetime, but they will also have a wartime role and mission as well. So there are plenty of reports out there, current reports. The 2022 report on space weaponization by CSIS and by the Secure World Foundation will give you a very solid platform on the type of weapon systems that we are seeing and looking for emerging uh, present today. And we imagine that the situation is going to get worse. And so with that, I actually will turn it over to see if there's any types of questions regarding wargaming, regarding space weaponization. How has Space Command mentality developed? Are they still thinking like Air Force personnel? Dude, that is a brilliant question, and thank you so much. Thank you. This school was created as a tribute to the Air Force not thinking properly. Okay, let me tell you. They think that space exists to support the warfighter. In fact, all of our space generals who were raised by the Air Force, every time they have a commander's call, every time they publish a document, every time they talk to the Secretary of the Air Force and to Congress, they talk about how the Space Force exists to support the warfighter. That is not true. That is fallacious. Space exists to support all of the instruments of national power, and that is what we do every day around the world, 365 days a year, continuously, without interruption, even if you get into a war someplace else. 100% of the capacity on all of our satellites in the Space Force are busy continuously doing regular day-to-day missions. GPS, for example. Think about our communications satellites. Our communication satellites are very busy moving not just military, but all of government data, largely banking transactions, national treasury data, etc. We have to secure that type of stuff. It's kind of like your Space Force. Think of the stagecoaches that Wells Fargo used to run across the West back during the 1800s. That's kind of the way it is with space right now. The other thing that's really problematic for all the type of government traffic that we're doing every day, we can't stop doing that when we get into a war someplace. When we get into a war someplace, we lease the finest commercial capabilities to support the warfighter. That's how it works. And trying to get our senior leaders to wake up to how our satellites are apportioned and their capacities are apportioned has proven impossible. I strongly suspect it's because of the budgetary necessity to say that we support the warfighter in order to garner budget. I'm not entirely sure that whether that's the case or not. They don't come down here and talk to me. I'm the guy that has to say, I don't represent the US government. These are my opinions. But I have sat on console with these satellites for years, and we see what's going on. Uh, Along with that, the Air Force is continuing to push this, what we call a very brown water perspective. Now, this is another Navy analogy. We have found that the air power analogy does not apply to space hardly at all. But the maritime does, because we have a carrying trade. We have commerce that we have to protect. We are at sea in space all the time. We don't get the luxury the Air Force has that they get to come down and land, go to the club, have a beer, etc. It's always Burger King at rush hour in every one of our space squadrons. It is a constant rush all the time to meet the global demand of all of the instruments of national power. And it's not just American national power. We're also aiding and abetting, if that's the right term, all of our allies, friends, and neighbors to ensure that their global economy stays up as well, because it's not in our interest to see them collapse, because you know how it's like there's this trickle down that happens if somebody has a ripple in their economy. It happens here. Who the hell would have guessed that the grain out of Ukraine would rip into our food markets the way it has? So, you see, these are the types of things that space professionals in reality have to deal with. We don't get the luxury of supporting the warfighter. That would be great. That means that we're absolutely unemployed right now because there's no war and no warfighter going on someplace. But we're still having to go to work because we're doing everything everywhere all the time. And it's hard to communicate to people that are episodic warfighters that they are not our top priority. For their top priority, we will lease for them the finest commercial capabilities. Problem being, those commercial capabilities are not defended. But don't worry about it. We're not defending our own satellites either. Let me repeat that. Your US Space Force assets are sitting up there a little bit encrypted, but those super soft, high fidelity little sensors on the exterior of those satellites, those fragile little things hanging there, are undefended. The signals, the pathways, undefended. To some degree, our satellites are like soldiers thrown out in no man's land in the First World War. And the adversary has so many counter space weapons. And our policy is that we will defend them through resiliency. You know what that means? Throwing more satellites into no man's land to give them more targets to shoot at. How did that work in the First World War? Try to run them out of machine gun bullets with lives. So we're going to try to run them out of what? Their jammers, their lasers, all these things that they can swing from one satellite to the next. And we're going to try to defeat them by giving them more targets to shoot at. Our satellites cost millions, tens of millions, billions of dollars, and their jammers cost hundreds of dollars. How well is that going to work? And with that, I'm going to shut the F up.
I will say, just to add, that I'm not going to let the Space Force off the hook on this one either. With the same caveat that I'm speaking for myself and not the U.S. government or the Air Force or the Space Force or anything like that. A group of Space Force supporters really did try to push a different culture, a different way of doing things, different symbols, different cultures. Ranks was my big thing. And all of those efforts were defeated because the leadership of the Space Force just has no interest in doing, in my opinion, anything new. And the Department of the Air Force has no interest in letting them do anything new. So if you know what's good for you in the Space Force, toe the line. Again, that's my personal opinion, but you see that quite a bit. So is there a new culture going on? No. Some people would like to think that because there's a marginally different uniform and we have a different, chief of space operations, that there's cultural growth going on. Not in the slightest. And I do not think that anyone could put a good argument that it is. Now, granted, we on this, panel, at least 2/3 of us have been fighting this fight for a while and are, what most people would call zealots, which I think is not the right term, but we've been thinking about this for a long time and have operated in it, for a long time. But no, I do not think the Space Force or Space Command is showing any cultural growth whatsoever. And if anyone wants to call me on it, I will argue them at any time, at any place, in any audience.
Cricket, I'm going to call you on it. Don't be a pussy. What do you really think?
Yeah, academic freedom only goes so far, right?
Now y'all know what the rest of the department is like in general when you come to Space Department at ACSC. We're all like this. So if I can pop in on this one, are there any up and coming groups we should watch as potential big players in this environment? I think commercial space, not just SpaceX or Blue Origin. Look outside the U.S. for commercial space, because whether they're trying to get into greater abilities to launch, whether it's a slingshot, centrifugal force, or it's trying to find ways to send up more smaller satellites to different ways to do geostationary. Commercial is a good way. Also look at emerging states and emerging launch states. Like we're seeing not just in Latin America with Brazil, and I forget the other one, but there are emerging states. There are states that are emerging as space powers that have with launch capabilities and what those launch capabilities mean. So when you think about launching in the United States, government owns most of it, but commercial can lease it. And so you have the ability to launch not just government payloads into space, but also commercial payloads. And what does that mean when you have more states that have locations that are useful for launching into orbits, coming onto the stage? So seeing more of those emerging space powers and where they're located, and also thinking about what their world perspectives are, because those perspectives affect how they see and what they're going to invest in for space.
I typically tell people to pay attention to what's going on in North Korea and Iran. Those two nations have got every type of motivation to try to leapfrog ahead of other nations and also to become an even bigger burr in our side.
I would also say, look at Luxembourg. You wouldn't think that, but take a look at what they're doing, especially on space policy. It's a lot of interesting stuff, trying to position themselves to be in an interesting, up and coming market. Oh, I think you're referring to the CSIS report.
Yeah, you guys pass
Yeah.
me those links and I'll put them up on Discord later.
Yeah, very easy.
Yeah, the war on space junk. You know, we're really getting flailed. We're getting nailed on that. Recently, the last couple of days, they announced that the United States is banning on orbit, or I should say, orbital testing of kinetic anti-satellite weapons. And of course, right away, the Russians came out and they said, obviously, the United States has already fielded their anti-satellite kinetic weapons, or they would not ban the testing of them. And of course, that is what our accusation of them was when they and the Chinese put forward a treaty into the United Nations that they hope to negotiate for the elimination of on-orbit ASATs. Well, I'd like to say something about that. There are two communities out there that are really pushing hard on the space debris issue. One is the arms control community, and they use the excuse of, ASATs will cause debris. And of course, then you have the environmentalist community as well, who jumps in on top of that. Oh, debris is bad. That's like pollution, and you can deny people the use of space. Both of those are true, but I want you to keep in mind that the area of space in the cislunar environment that we're talking about is 73 trillion cubic miles. So there's plenty of space up there, but they are really interested in those most tactically and commercially relevant spots and locations that are becoming congested. That's really where we need to focus our space debris removal type of capabilities. And of course, the arms control community freaks out whenever anybody says space debris removal, because they're concerned that that could be a weapon. And yep, you ought to be concerned that that's a weapon, because that is precisely what it will be used as if you need to use it as a weapon. But we don't freak out when we have ships at sea, which is much smaller than 73 trillion cubic miles, when they're out there on the ocean trying to clean up the oceanic debris. We don't freak out that there's Navy ships with guns. In fact, we feel pretty relieved because of the pirating situation out there. So why there is this disproportionate concern about space being weaponized compared to every other environment here on Earth? It simply is a last bastion that the arms control community has fallen back on. The big bridge issue for them was March 23rd, 1983, when President Reagan gave his Strategic Defense Initiative speech. They were at that time in the arms control community all wired up about nuclear weapons. Well, as the nuclear weapons threat started to decline, they needed something else to remain in employment, so they jumped over to the space issue and been working that ever since. I am not particularly concerned about the degree of space weaponization. I am particularly concerned about the disingenuous arguments that are being used, particularly in and around our members of Congress, by non-government organizations in Washington, D.C., trying to disparage the United States from protecting and defending its satellites. That's what bothers me the most.
So all opinions are my own, but again, the in some ways, the whole space is a sanctuary argument creates a whole bunch of issues, and then in many ways adds to fears that we're going to weaponize space, and space war is going to be horrible, and we're going to ruin the Earth. And I'm like, not likely. And two, chances are, if you did do war in space, you turn into a mad situation where you basically make it so that nobody could have anything in space. And that's mostly with, and while that's truly true about low Earth orbit, not so sure about medium or the geo belt. Sorry, brain fart. But the idea that space, because of the way it is, doesn't clean itself. If you think about air and you think about the sea, you blow up a boat, it sinks, kind of like the Russian warship that got promoted to submarine. And so when you think about the idea of blowing up and going to war in space and causing kinetic damage, and also if you think about if you actually manage to permanently disable some satellites as well, they're now debris. It's now trash. It's now something to be afraid about how you're going to not hit it in space. And so the idea that if you make something a weapon, I'm like, dude, there's very few things in the world that humans make that in some way you can't make a bad thing out of it. Like, let's just be honest, that's human nature. Yeah, they're going to clean up debris. That doesn't mean that somebody can't do a cyber hack on space and use it to go and monkey around and kidnap satellites.
As far as the question, are potential competitors doing any better at asset protection? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's a whole lot going on in asset protection, really. But when you think about it, it's still probably true that the United States has a deeper dependence on their space assets than maybe other people do. So we have more of an interest in asset protection. And people can complain about space weaponization all they want, but no one really thinks that the U.S. is just going to start shooting down or attacking space assets enough to protect them, quite honestly, because it definitely doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of activity in any regard with regard to like physical protection of space assets. It's still at the norms of behavior sort of approach, because even though it's expensive, sending a whole bunch of people to Geneva or Vienna to discuss things is a heck of a lot cheaper than trying to develop hardware. So there's just not a lot of stuff being protected up there one way or the other, from natural threats or artificial threats. Well, that's policy now, I guess. Does it impact anything? I don't know. It, like a buddy of mine said, telling a potential adversary that you're not going to do something right out of the bat doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of deterrence value. But what are you going to do?
And to add on to that, yeah, U.S. is not going to do ASAT tests. That Russia and China and other bad actors haven't said that they're not. So, okay.
I like this question from Jeff Beeler. World War I did teach us a great deal. There's several things that we need to be practicing in space in order to get out of the no man's land situation that we find ourselves in. There was an author named Stephen Biddle who wrote a chapter in one of his books called Military Power. And in that chapter, he talks about the modern system of warfare that came about during the First World War. The First World War was so horrible because of the advancements in the rate of fire, the range of fire, and the scale of the weapons. Just simply the size of calibers were just, it dwarfed imagination, and doctrine had not caught up with it. After the war, Sir Douglas Haig made the comment that he probably would have conducted the war differently on the continent if he had studied more closely the way the US Civil War had ended, in the trenches with automatic Gatling guns and with boys going over the top. I mean, the template was sort of there. But even after the US Civil War, which was still not at the peak of industrialization, that would happen about 30 years after the US Civil War, that those calibers and ranges and sizes and volumes of fire just dramatically increased. Well, Stephen Biddle identifies that there are certain elements that you need in order to get out of that no man's land when you're faced with that volume of fire. 1, concealment. 2, deception. 3, stealth. 4, small unit tactics. where one unit fires to cover the other while the other moves into a more advantageous position and lays down cover fire for the other unit to maneuver. But let's stop and talk about that. Fire and maneuver. Those are the two keys that space right now cannot do. It cannot maneuver. Those satellites are caught in the trap of orbital mechanics because we have not made the investment in the types of propulsive systems that would allow our satellites to maneuver freely away from the trap of orbital mechanics. Orbital mechanics is where you park something in order to enjoy the free ride that it gives you based on the energy it took you to get there. It's a parking thing. You park and you're parked at a velocity so you continue your orbital rotation. We are stuck in a bad place. We have got to have the type of propulsion that will be as revolutionary as going from the sail was for the Navy to steam. The sail only allowed the Navy to go where the wind would take them, when it would take them there. But when they got steam, they were able to go where they wanted, when they wanted. And naval power, the power of navies, magnified many-fold over because of that. The same is true about what will happen in space. If we pursue some of these types of propulsive systems that give you years of endless propulsion without having to refuel, and then when you refuel, it lasts years more. Systems such as nuclear thermal propulsion can give that to us. There's other different types of propulsion out there that I don't want to go into here, but would give us that type of freedom to maneuver. Now, a clever mind will say, but if you maneuver, your users can't find your satellites and therefore they're not able to use the satellites. That's true to some extent. What we need are ground stations that those satellites collect the mission related data that's so urgent for commerce, for diplomacy, for business, etc., and also for the military. But while they're dodging and maneuvering so the enemy can't find them, and if you can't find them, you can't shoot them, download that information to ground stations that could be as prolific as cellular or mobile telephone towers that could have, a satellite receiver set there that can just translate that data from space into mobile telephone data, and commercial users, military users could simply use their simple devices in order to capture that space collected data and continue to operate. So yes, there is a way to get out of the trap of no man's land. It starts with maneuver. The second thing is to return fire. We're going to have to return fire in kind, and we're going to have to suppress those types of enemy systems that fire at our satellites. Much as we do suppression of enemy air defense, we're going to have to do the same for enemy space defense. And that analogy with air power does fit quite well. Stealth and anti-detection in space works better than stealth and anti-detection in the air.
Because space is way too big to track everything. And we also don't have the equipment up there to track everything.
That's in part true. Plus, ray theory. If you've heard of ray theory, a radar's ability to return a signal is predicated on how close to the target it is actually located. The closer to the target a radar radiates, the more trons you're going to collect back. The further away, and think of the distances of space, it's harder. Now, it is true that there's different types of techniques. You can track an object because of its heat against the cold mat of space. There's different techniques that we can use to hide heat signals, towed decoys, other types of systems that we can use to ruin an adversary's intelligence estimate about what a satellite is. I've long been an advocate for having Mylar bags all over our satellites, that when our satellites rise to different parts of the globe, you inflate this Mylar bag and it looks like one kind of satellite. And then when it goes past the next sensor, the other side inflates and it looks like something else. Just play this game with them. It can be that simple. And, I love the X-37B. Whenever X-37B goes up, all the adversaries slew their sensors just to see what the hell X-37B is up to, because it's just too interesting, right? Just too good. And we tell you exactly what it is. We're just doing onboard sensor tests and things like that because we can't do it on the International Space Station and we don't have a shuttle anymore. So we take up these little tiny kit test sets and we leave them up on orbit for a couple of years. Some of the studies are as subtle as turn this switch on and off 10,000 times and see whether or not there's an arc sparking problem with it. because it might help explain a problem that's going on one of our other satellites. And it's that simple. And we tell everybody exactly what we go, this is a secret mission. And then we tell you what the mission is. And then everybody goes, well, that can't possibly be that simple. So everybody starts slewing their sensors and watching it. And the fact that I've told you what the trick is doesn't ruin it. They still do it. And so the other thing that's interesting to me about X-37B is when it comes down, studying the exterior surfaces of the X-37B. And what we discover is that space is dirty. That external surface is dirty, dusty, pitted. We have this image of space as being pristine and clean. It isn't. It's filled with a lot of leftover slag, debris, and dust from the formation of everything that we see.
Well, we have Mahan. At least that's my opinion. I read his book, The Influence of Sea Power, upon history when I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, and it stuck with me ever since. He informs my writings quite a bit. What I will tell you in this audience is that we do not need new space theory. We've got plenty. We need actors that will actually act on it, decide what is good and what isn't, and then push forward. Some books that you might be interested in reading. Oh gosh, I probably have a stack of them up here, but just some people. John Klein wrote Space Warfare. He has another book called Understanding Space Strategy. That means an awful lot to me. I like his thoughts on lines of communication quite well. My own first attempt at a book, Developing National Power in Space. I still stand by it. There's Astropolitique with a K, with Everett Dolman. Yep, there it is. There's a lot of stuff going on in the space power theory world, and there's a lot of people that are starting to develop, where a lot of the major theorists aren't arguing about big things. We're focusing on little minor details on what should be focused on. Is military space power more important? Is economic space power more important? But the simple fact of the matter is the people that are in charge of, developing policy and strategy do not listen to us theorists. That's just the way it goes. But that's sort of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to, here at Air Command and Staff College, trying to get the Space Force majors and other people to read this stuff and know this stuff exists. So hopefully in the next decade, when they start to become general officers, they'll have more of a sophisticated theoretical understanding at the very least. But we have all the Mahan we need. We just need to act on it. Great question, by the way, though. These are great questions.
Yeah, if I could, I'd like to just give you guys just a little bit of a reading list because I'm a professor and this is kind of what I do. There is a book that's extremely Mahanian that's out there, written by a Welshman named Bleden Bowen. It's called War in Space, Strategy, Space Power, and Geopolitics. And it will wet your whistle and presents a cogent space power theory. Already introduced by Dr. Ziarnick is Understanding Space Strategy, The Art of War in Space by John Patsy Klein. Yep, Patsy. That's his call sign from the Navy. Patsy uses Corbett's theory to frame his space power theory. Quite interesting, and I think you will enjoy this read as well. A new entrant into the space power literature group is Space Power Ascendant by a gentleman named Joshua Carlson. Josh was a student here 2 years ago, and when COVID hit, he'd already written such a compelling student thesis that, okay, we kind of poked and prodded him to force him to expand this out. It provides what he calls space development theory and a new space strategy. His assessment is that if the U.S. continues on its current space strategy, that it is a recipe for defeat. Simply, we are not going to be able to compete against the Chinese unless we change the way we do things. The next book that I called to your attention, again, another Mahanian advocate, Developing National Space Power in Space, a Theoretical Model, written by some bozo. And
Yeah, I can't stand that guy. What a jerk,
Yeah.
man.
A book that I want to also commend to you because it focuses on the economic imperative of space. As I said earlier, we have a commercial carrying trade on orbit, like the oceans have a carrying trade. This book is written by uh, Namrata Goswami and Peter Garretson. They frequently appear here at our school and teach. It's called Scramble for the Skies: The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. Woo! Now, we also have another book here called Winning Space. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I like winning space. I like winning. Winning is good. Winning is like better than losing. And this is written by Brandon Weichert. And it's a new book that we're using starting next year. But we figure the guy's got the right attitude. Winning space? Yeah, you're going to get my attention with that one. But I want to go back and I want to show you a book that was the first complete space power theory. It came out in February of 1958. It was a Book of the Month Club book back when Americans used to read. You know, there was no television. Reading. You guys remember reading? No, now there's television. Okay. So it's called Spacepower: What It Means to You. And this book can be picked up. This book can be picked up on Amazon. It's an old book. Look at these guys. Don't they look like pretty classic guys? Anyway, and it's filled with great artwork like this. It's so cool. It's written by Donald Cox, who was a professor here at Air Command Staff College, and Michael Stoiko, who was a journalist. And the two of them conspired shortly after Sputnik to put together this book. And what is really magnificent about this book is in the same paragraphs, they'll express realist concerns and idealist aspirations. And it comes across as one of the best balanced books, and it makes some predictions. They predicted that America would go to the moon by 1970. They figured that we would have the moon pretty much settled by 1980, 85, and be off to Mars. They got their early predictions right, but they didn't anticipate that beating the Russians to the moon would take the wind out of our sails to go to space in a big way. Anyway, so there's your reading assignments. And send me a note when you're done with them so we can ask you a few questions for the exam.
I did put them in Discord.
I really think that entirely depends on what you're trying to get out of the war game, right? If you want trying to, have a tactical war game that might be able to teach, space crews or, politicians or, procurement people or anything like that. What is useful in the Space Force, they call it 1v1 engagements, 1 versus 1 satellite engagements, or 2v1 or whatever. At a tactical level, you can dispense with a lot of politics and other things to just try to figure out what it takes to actually fight in space at the single unit level. Then again, if you want someone that's a little bit better at whole of government competition and deterrence and stuff like that, you're going to want to add the political military ideas. You're going to want to add other things like domestic legislation, international treaties, other stuff like that. And if you want to just try to figure out what the next couple of decades might be, you're going to want a game that can incorporate both civil ideas, civil programs, military theory, military programs, commercial activities. And as you get broader and broader in scope, you're going to need to have a broader and broader tent on what's useful and what's not useful. Maybe if you're a lieutenant, captain, staff sergeant, or, specialist nowadays, you're not going to care about what the Secretary of the Air Force or the director of NASA or NASA administrator or anything says at any particular time. But as you get older, you're going to need to. And if you're going to be a politician, you don't really need to know the probability of kill of a microwave satellite going, a microwave maser going, 2,000 kilometers a second or anything like that. You're just going to need to know its probability of kill of system v system, which is probably going to be classified like mad if we understand that information to begin with. So it really depends on where you're going. But again, I've already told you that I like strategic games a lot more because it adds a broader understanding of space, which people really desperately need right now. All right. Well, if there are no more questions.
This was fun. Y'all have fun?
Well, the idea is, did you all get something out of it? And the answer is, we hope so, because space is very important, and we have war gamers everywhere for land, over this, land campaigns over thousands of years. There's, there's sea games from, as far back as we can remember to as, to modern day stuff. I'm sure when they mentioned that, a couple of Neptune missiles might have taken down the Moskva, I'm sure that we had gamers going out there trying to figure out where their Black Sea Fleet board game was to try to figure out, how things like that could have happened. There's not a whole lot of stuff with space. There really isn't. So I'm hoping that you get a lot of, best of luck to you if you design one. If you want to start playing them, best of luck to you there. Let's, get out there because, there's a lot of interesting things going on out there. And I'm sure Phil Eklund and Andrew Rader could probably use the money to buy their stuff. But anyway, thank you very much for having me and everyone else. We really appreciated it. But I'll let you get back to a fine conference. Good luck, everybody.